Hey everyone, I am joined by Jeremy Gillula from the EFF. He is a senior technologist, and we're going to be talking about net neutrality today. So, the point of this discussion is rather than do the here's why net neutrality is important, here's why you should care about it, that's kind of been done to death. So, I'm going to be bringing up some counterpoints that we've seen in internet comments and from the FCC, and then Jeremy is going to be addressing those with his own counterpoints or clarification or things of that nature. So the idea is to bring both viewpoints to the table for the argument. That way we can get a fuller understanding of what's going on rather than just an elevator pitch of net neutrality.
But before we get into that, this coverage is brought to you by iFixit.com and their ProTech Toolkit. iFixit is refreshing their ProTech Toolkit in time for the holidays. You can find a link in the description below to the ProTech Toolkit and other toolkits that iFixit sells. We find the ProTech and Essentials kits to be the most useful for DIY enthusiasts.
So, Jeremy, let's start with the question of the net neutrality did not exist before 2015. So this is one we've seen in comments a lot where people say net neutrality wasn't even a thing until 2 years ago. So we have the same problems then as we did now. How does the repeal of net neutrality hurt that or help that? Or I think you see where I'm going with this one.
Totally. So I guess I'd start by saying that the premise of the question isn't 100% true. So it is true that we did not have official, written regulation enforcing net neutrality until 2015. That's true. But what we did have for basically 10 years leading up to that was the FCC saying that we are going to try to enforce net neutrality one way or another. It started when they tried to take action against Comcast for throttling BitTorrent back in 2006. Then they first tried one set of rules that a court threw out saying, you can't do it under Title I of the Communications Act. You have to reclassify ISPs as common carriers. And that's, of course, what led to the 2015 order. So while it's true that, the official, rules that have held in court didn't exist until 2015, for 10 years, we've had an FCC that has said, we are going to work to enforce net neutrality. We're just figuring out how. And the effect of that is that it deterred a lot of bad behavior that could have happened. So when you have an agency saying, we're working to enforce this, we're figuring out how to do it, if I'm a company, I'm going to say, I'm not, I wanted to throttle or block some website, but the FCC is determined to find some way to enforce net neutrality. So I'm not gonna, play that game and see, just how far I can get with blocking or throttling before I get in trouble. And so that's why I don't think it's quite right. I mean, another difference is that not only has this repeal, undone what the 2015 order did in terms of, bright line rules against blocking and throttling. This repeal has explicitly said, and the FCC has no authority over internet providers in any way, shape, or form, no matter how bad their behavior is. So they've actually gone, even further backwards than where we were in 2015 with what they've repealed, which, from my perspective, certainly is unfortunate. So I don't think it's the case that, we did have net neutrality before 2015. We had an agency that was trying to enforce net neutrality one way or another. It had missteps, certainly. So we do have the same problems and more that we did in 2015. Now we've got the same problems we had back in 2006 when Comcast got away with throttling BitTorrent and just saying to anyone using BitTorrent, nah, go find a different internet service provider.
Right. So then talking about the different agencies that can contribute to governing or overseeing net neutrality, the idea, as I understand it now, is that a lot of these obligations would be handed off to the FTC. If that's, I think that's kind of, okay. So that's kind of my understanding of it. So then the next question is, well, can't we just trust the FTC to do the same job? Or, where's the disconnect there? Why can't the FTC do the same job as the FCC?
So the reason we can't trust. I mean, the reason relying on the FTC won't work is the FTC's only authority is to regulate unfair and deceptive, or at least with respect to what, the types of things we'd want them to regulate with respect to net neutrality, is to regulate unfair and deceptive trade practices. So what that means is that if your internet provider says in their fine print, oh, and by the way, we're going to throttle, all of these websites, and we're going to block your access to these other websites, then you can't complain to the FTC because it's not unfair or deceptive. They told you they were going to do it. They went ahead and did what they said they were going to do, and the FTC will just look at you and say, look, it was in the fine print. What are you going to? I mean, we can't take any action against them. They were transparent, and so that's why this argument that somehow the FTC will be able to play the cop on the beat and make sure that internet providers are on their best behavior, it rings hollow. All the FTC can do is make sure that internet providers don't go further than what they say they're going to do. And you can bet that internet providers, I mean, Comcast already deleted its open internet pledge. And so they're being transparent, they're being honest, and the FTC can't do anything about that. So the FTC can make sure that the things they do are the things that, the bad behavior we see is the bad behavior they tell us they're going to do, which is cold comfort, I think.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a good way of putting it, I think. So if we take that same scenario of the ISPs declare in the fine print what it is they're doing, and then we just go back to where we have the FCC overseeing it as opposed to the FTC, what's the difference there in how those two agencies would react to what you might consider unfair trade practices?
So I think the big difference is that the FCC does have authority to create regulations about how internet providers can conduct their business, about, in particular, how they can manage traffic on their networks. So the FTC doesn't have any statutory authority to do that. The FTC is not allowed by law to put out the kinds of, no blocking, no throttling rules that we had up until a few days ago, whereas the FCC can. And so that's the big reason why it makes a lot more sense for the FCC to be the one doing it, because they can actually make rules that prohibit the bad behavior we don't want internet providers to take part in.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Next question then. This is another comment we saw on Twitter. So this one's pretty common. It's the idea that the free market will decide. So if you don't like your ISP, the free market will find a way to correct it, make that better, and give you, the consumer, better options. So what would be your response to that?
So it's interesting. So a little bit of backstory here. As you mentioned, I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Up until probably about 3 years ago or so, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 2.5, something like that. EFF was actually very much against having the FCC put forward any sort of regulations on internet providers. And we were very much of the opinion, we should just let the free market take care of this. If Comcast does something terrible, you can switch to a different ISP and get better service. Our eventual realization, though, was that that's not working. I mean, if you look at broadband companies across the USA, I think the statistic is something like half of Americans have at most, it's either at most 1 or 2 choices in broadband. So basically you get cable or DSL, and of course DSL is slow, so nobody really wants DSL. So you basically only have one choice when it comes to broadband. And there is really not any competition. I mean, these companies have agreed not to build over each other's service areas. I mean, they've got these agreements that say, Comcast will not encroach on an area where Charter already has service. And so that's the reality. I mean, the reality is simply that there is no free market competition right now. You can't choose to use a different ISP. And to be clear, there are a few exceptions to that. If you live in a major metropolitan area, you might have a few more choices. San Francisco is great. We've got even some small local ISPs that are really good on net neutrality. But if you live in most of the country, a lot of suburban areas and especially a lot of rural areas where you may not even have cable as a choice, you really only have DSL as a choice, or maybe even satellite, which is kind of scary. You don't. There is no competition, and so when there's no competition, the free market can't help you. Now, some people could say, well, or at least an argument I've heard is that may be true now, but if the practices get really awful enough, then there will be demand, and new ISPs will come in. I think the issue with that argument, or the issue I have, is that starting a new ISP is ridiculously expensive because infrastructure is expensive. Starting a software company is easy. You just find, 2 people to write some software and you're set. Starting an ISP is a lot harder because it takes a lot more than 2 people to dig all of the trenches, to lay all of the fiber, to make the connections to people's homes, to get the backhaul in that connects to the local peering point. All of these things that are it just costs a lot of upfront capital to do. And I think that's the real reason. I mean, part of it is, that these are giant, corporations, and it's tough to compete against them. But part of it is, even if, that wasn't an issue, just starting an ISP is ridiculously expensive. And so it's hard to imagine that you're going to get a lot of people saying, I've got the cash to throw into this company and we'll see if it works. And it's not going to make, we're not talking, an investment where I'll get, Google-sized returns, 10 years down the line or something like that. It's, so yeah.
Well, and speaking of Google too, they're having enough trouble on their own starting up an ISP. Google Fiber hasn't necessarily had it easy. So if a company the size of Google is struggling to roll out, I can't imagine how difficult it would be for an upstart.
I think that's a great point. I mean, and part of the reason Google has struggled is because not only do you have the cost prohibitions, but you have these companies, Comcast and Verizon, at&t, they have a huge lobbying budget, and they can lobby in state and local governments to keep a new competitor out. And so that's part of it too, is that these corporations have just extensive political power, particularly at the state and local level. And so, yeah, I mean, if Google can't do it, it's kind of hard to believe that. I mean, there's lots of things that, I'm sure people can do that Google couldn't pull off. But it does indicate that there is some difficulty there. It's not as easy as you might think.
Right. So what about the topic of, this is another internet comment, the government created these monopolies and duopolies in the first place. So that's one we've seen as well. So
I think that's true to some extent. I mean, when you think of, giving companies access to the right of way and that sort of thing, having, exclusive franchise agreements, it's true to some extent. But that doesn't mean that the right thing to do is to then abdicate responsibility for overseeing these government-created monopolies and duopolies. It's like saying, Frankenstein created his monster, and then he should just let it go wander in the village and attack people. Like, that's, if you created it, then you have a little bit of responsibility to either undo the damage you did and make, alternatives to the monster, or rein in the monster's behavior. And so, I mean, I agree to some extent, but I think it's kind of not, it doesn't help with arguing against why we shouldn't have some bright line net neutrality rules.
I've got a couple quotes from the FCC as well. So this one was published in The Verge a couple months ago, and I believe it was Ajit Pai who claimed that Title II classifications, quote, hurt low-income rural and urban neighborhoods, and said that the effect would be accelerated digital redlining, and said that these neighborhoods would be the first areas where internet providers cut their spending.
That might be true if internet providers were cutting their spending. There were no indications that internet providers were cutting their spending as a result of the net neutrality order. I mean, you look at quotes from CEOs and CFOs from some of these internet providers. I mean, in 2016, the CEO of at&t said that we're investing aggressively in the network architecture that is going to give us a competitive advantage in cost, and we continue to invest in spectrum. You had the CEO of Time Warner Cable back in 2016 saying that, once again, we invested heavily in our network and equipment, network investments to drive better reliability and greater capacity. The CFO of Verizon in 2016 said, we remain committed to consistently investing in our network for the future. Our 2015 investments have positioned us for growth and allow us to maintain our network leadership position as consistently acknowledged by third parties. Sorry about that. So, I mean, I'd be worried if it were true. I certainly don't want to see digital redlining, but that's not what we're seeing in reality. Ajit Pai might be living in a different reality than the rest of us, and I feel sorry for him if that's the case. But it's not what we were seeing. We were seeing continued investment, no decrease in investment. And I actually think it's the flip. I would almost say it's the opposite, because as I mentioned, low income, particularly rural neighborhoods, rural areas, as I mentioned, don't have a lot of choice when it comes to their internet service provider. And so if you end up stuck with one that is going to throttle your speeds to certain websites that you want, and only provide fast lanes to the websites you don't want, or block access to websites that you really want to get access to, you're out of luck, right? You might as well, again, that's effectively the same as your internet provider cutting access when they cut back their spending, because they're not giving you access to what you want to be able to access. So I really don't see how reducing people's ability to control what they can access is somehow going to help, low-income rural and urban neighborhoods.
Right. I have another quote from the FCC. So this one was, broadband providers will have stronger incentives to build networks, especially in unserved areas, and to upgrade networks to gigabit speeds and 5G. This was a public statement promoting the repeal of net neutrality. They further stated, this means there will be more competition among broadband providers. It also means more ways that startups and tech giants alike can deliver applications and content to more users. And then concluding, in short, it's a freer and more open internet. Any response to that one?
So that is what I would call doublespeak. It's using words to say the opposite of what they actually mean. I mean, it's almost like straight out in 1984. So I guess the first thing is, again, to emphasize that broadband providers already had plenty of incentive to build networks, especially in unserved areas. They were not losing money because of net neutrality. They were certainly, and I will, not mince words about this, unable or prevented from extracting every last penny and really squeezing money out of both their customers and third parties, the edge providers, the websites, the startups. Were they, prevented from squeezing as much money as they could from those two sides? Yes, that's true. But their fundamental business model of, I'm going to take your data and send it to where you want me to send it to, and vice versa, they were not struggling with that. And so I think it's a little disingenuous to say that somehow, there is no evidence that they're going to, build networks in unserved areas. We can now, if this repeal stands, we can wait and see, and we can test that theory. We'll see. In terms of more competition among broadband providers, again, that's just not true. Certainly among wired providers. As I explained before, it costs a lot of money to build out a wired network, and so there's no reason to think that you will see more competition from new entrants. And in terms of a freer and more open internet, again, I fail to see how an internet where if I've got some cool new app and I want to, I want to distribute it to the world. I'm now going to have to go and potentially pay, a dozen different internet providers or more, and that's only if we're talking about the big ones. But if I have to go pay a dozen different internet providers to make sure that I don't get throttled down to some, minimal speed, that doesn't sound like a freer and more open internet for me. If I have to pay to be able to, because the Googles and Netflixes, the Microsofts, the Facebooks, they are all going to be able to pay the internet providers for fast lanes now that fast lanes are blessed by the FCC. The companies that won't be able to pay are small businesses and startups. And so if you want to compete, if you've got something that you think is the next Facebook killer, you're going to have to pay, and you're going to have to figure out, you're going to have to work into your budget. Not only do I have to pay a bunch of smart engineers to build this app, I also have to pay all of these big internet providers just so I can reach people at the same speed as Facebook or Google.
But going back to what you were just saying about Facebook and potential competition, there's a lot of discussion of startups and new companies might have to pay to get fair access or distribution. So in your eyes, or in the EFF's eyes, how likely a scenario is that to actually happen? At what is this getting blown out of proportion online, or is this like an actual, real, immediate concern?
So from my perspective, I actually think this is the most likely outcome. I think that's the first thing that you're going to see once the rules actually, and again, to be clear, the rules haven't gone into effect yet because they have to get published in the Federal Register to become official regulations, and that could take months. But once that happens, I think it's the first thing. I think you're much more likely to see internet providers start offering fast lane services, and then of course you'll see the big companies jump right in and pay because they know that if I want someone to use my product, an extra second or two of load time will just kill the proportion of people that use my product. I think it's more, it's the first thing you'll see. You'll see that before you start seeing, Comcast or Verizon blocking specific websites, before you see them like offering separate packages for social media or for streaming video. Although, to be honest, we're already seeing that to some degree. I think every single one of the major mobile carriers now, just by default, throttles streaming video and just says that's what we do. And if you want HD video, you have to pay us more, which is directly against net neutrality.
Right. They also throttle uploads too, which we know from uploading YouTube videos.
Oh yeah, exactly. If it looks like video streaming, it gets throttled. And so I think you'll see the order in which you'll see things is, fast lanes immediately being offered, immediately being snapped up, and immediately causing trouble for small businesses and startups that want to compete with more entrenched players. The second thing you'll see is a lot more differentiation of traffic on mobile networks. Even more so than we already do in terms of streaming video. And I think you'll see both of those things first, and then the rest of it is going to be more subtle. I think it will take a little time before we see, you have to pay X more dollars a month if you want to get Facebook or Twitter, that sort of thing. I think that will take a little longer because the ISPs are wary of the backlash that would cause. Whereas the other things, either people aren't, won't be consciously aware of it, it's not sort of in your face, or like with zero rating and throttling video, it's harder for people to notice it.
Right. With the idea of fast lanes, do you see that being more of something that is offered to the consumer, or is this more of like a business-to-business fast lane?
What I'm talking about is more of a business-to-business fast lane, something where an ISP says to some edge provider, some website, or some app, hey, if you want to access our customers, pay us this much per month, and we will give you a faster connection, or we'll prioritize your traffic. And then by doing that, people will use your service more, and you'll make more revenue above and beyond what you have to pay us, which is probably true, but it stifles competition.
Right. Yeah, that's a huge competitive advantage for anyone who already is an incumbent in their space. So, two more main ones here. One is about VPNs. So, for people who are considering the option or already using VPNs uh, to protect themselves, do you foresee these net neutrality changes impacting those users? I mean, if I say, well, I have a VPN, so they can't see what I'm doing anyway. Yeah, how does that come back to me if net neutrality is repealed?
They could start throttling VPN traffic. Like if a particularly pernicious internet provider has decided, I want to, squeeze as much money out of my customers as possible. So if they want to be able to stream video at more than at HD quality, HD speeds, they're going to have to pay, an extra $5 a month or $10 a month. And then I really want to enforce that. I can also start throttling VPNs and say, same thing if you want to use a VPN, you have to pay me $10 a month. Otherwise, and they won't say it's throttled. They'll say, it's here is your normal speed, and if you want the higher speed, you have to pay more. Which is the same thing as saying this is, the higher speed is the normal speed, and we're throttling you otherwise. So fast lanes, slow lanes. It's the fact that there's a difference there that really matters. And so, I think that might take a little bit longer. Again, this is not something we're going to see overnight. They're going to, do trial balloons. They'll try things in certain areas. They'll start trying practices, maybe not announcing it in some big splashy announcement, but only, having it in their fine print at first until people catch on. The ISPs aren't dumb. They're going to be subtle about this so as to avoid a backlash, because a public backlash they know is disaster for them. So they're going to be smart about how they do it. They're clever.
Right. Last major question for you here is we have about 55% international viewers for our YouTube channel. So only maybe 45% or so of the folks are in the US, 8% in Canada, then you have all over the world. Does any of this impact those people who don't live in the US?
So I think there's two ways I would say that it potentially impacts people not in the U.S. One, I would say, and this is a positive impact for people who don't live in the U.S. because it's kind of a negative impact for people who do, is that I can definitely see this affecting where innovation online in terms of, what are the physical hubs of activity and areas where this sort of thing happens. If I'm a new startup and I want to be able to try out, my new app and I want to, get feedback, maybe I won't target the US first as a market. Maybe I'll target some other market that has net neutrality first so I can work out all the kinks and, really, establish myself as an awesome app first before I have to go pay Comcast and Verizon huge fees to access the American market. Certainly, my goal will eventually be to get into the American market, but for testing and really, trying things out, I might not decide to start there. And that's unfortunate for Americans and certainly a benefit for the rest of the world. So I guess a little bit of unintended good news for international folks. The other thing, though, that I would watch out for is that a lot of times policy ideas get exported from the U.S. Other countries see that, oh, the U.S. did this, so why don't we try it too? We've seen that with copyright policy. It's to disastrous effect. We've seen that with other intellectual property, patent reform, that sort of, or lack thereof, that sort of thing. And so, I would worry that, if a internet provider in another country got enough political power and managed to convince local politicians that, hey, the U.S. did this, and we don't want to fall behind, so let's, get rid of our net neutrality rules too. And so I'd keep an eye out for that. I think it's entirely possible. Again, it'll take time. This isn't going to happen overnight, but it's something to keep an eye out for.
Good answer there. Finally, so for anyone who wants to get involved or maybe feel like you're a little helpless or your voice doesn't matter or anything like that, obviously the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, is a great place that we've used for resources. So how can folks leverage the EFF, or what else can they do to get involved?
So if you're in the US, the first and foremost thing you can do is, because these regulations haven't taken effect yet, so some of your viewers may remember back at the beginning of 2017, Congress ended up repealing a bunch of privacy rules that the FCC had put out about internet providers and what they could do with your personal information. It turns out that Congress could use the same procedural setup to undo this repeal of net neutrality rules. So if you go to act.eff.org, act.eff.org, and you scroll down, the very first thing you'll see is protect the open internet order. And you can basically, it's a setup where you punch in your phone number, your address, we'll figure out who your Congress people are, and then you can contact them, both your representative and your senators, and tell them how important net neutrality is to you, and that you expect them to use what's called the Congressional Review Act, the CRA, to overturn this repeal of net neutrality. And so if we have success with that, then thankfully this discussion will have been moot, because the Senate will have and Congress will have acted and said, nope, sorry, FCC, you can't do that. You have to keep the net neutrality rules. And so that's where we're focusing our efforts at the moment.
Okay, so that was act.eff.org.
Yep. Just scroll down to protect the open internet order, and it'll walk you through all the steps. It'll give you talking points to talk to legislative staff, etc.
Okay, well, if you want to get involved, we'll leave a link in the description below for act.eff.org. If you have any further questions about this topic, or if you agree or disagree with anything, also leave a comment, and maybe we can loop back again later and talk about that. But depending on how things go with the rest of net neutrality, we'll see where this discussion goes. So, Jeremy, thank you for joining me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we will see you all next time.